When he met the new cook, the millionaire was shocked to see the earrings she was wearing, identical to the ones his missing daughter wore 20 years ago. Before we start the story, comment below which city you're watching the video from. In the heart of a sprawling, secluded estate stood the Grand Perez mansion, a place where the weight of secrets and lingering memories seemed to press even time itself into stillness. Behind its ancient stone walls, Felipe Perez lived trapped in a world of shadows, a prisoner to wounds that refused to heal. His eyes carried a distant gaze, and his solemn demeanor spoke of a man who had long lost his spark. Once filled with laughter and joy, his home had become a hushed memorial. Every corner whispered the name Amanda, his daughter who had vanished 20 years ago. Since that tragic day, Felipe had been just a shadow of his former self. One quiet morning, as the usual silence wrapped around the mansion like a heavy blanket, an unexpected sound broke through. Light footsteps echoed down the corridor, followed by the warm voice of Rosa, the loyal housekeeper. She was introducing the latest addition to the household staff, Victoria, a young cook. There was something different about her, something more than her unassuming appearance. Her energy seemed to brighten the room, like a shaft of sunlight piercing through dense clouds. Felipe, who rarely engaged with the staff, found himself drawn to her. From his secluded corner, he watched as Victoria moved deftly around the kitchen. Then something stopped him cold. A small, teardrop-shaped earring dangled from her ear, delicate and unmistakable. His heart pounded. That earring was one he could never forget. Amanda had been wearing it on the day she disappeared. The sight was a shock that hit him like a thunderclap. Could it really be a coincidence? Struggling to mask his emotions, Felipe stepped into the kitchen. His sudden appearance startled Victoria, causing her to drop a knife with a small yelp. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Perez. I didn't see you there," she said, her cheeks flushing. But Felipe's gaze remained locked on the earring. His voice, tense with emotion, finally broke the silence. "That earring, where did you get it?" Victoria looked confused, instinctively reaching for her right ear to touch the delicate piece of jewelry. "It's always been mine," she replied, her tone uncertain. "They told me it was found with me when I was a baby, along with an old blanket. I don't know where it came from." Her words echoed in Felipe's mind like thunder, reopening old wounds while igniting a fragile glimmer of hope he hadn't dared to feel in years. He murmured something incoherent, his voice thick with emotion, before retreating quickly from the kitchen. As he disappeared down the corridor, his eyes lingered on the earring, a small object that had just unleashed a tempest in his heart. That night, locked away in his study, Felipe held a photograph of Amanda in his trembling hands. Victoria's face wouldn't leave his mind. There was something about the young woman's features that struck a nerve, dredging up painful memories he had spent years trying to bury. Her large, expressive eyes, the absent-minded way she toyed with her hair, the gentle curve of her lips when she smiled, it all whispered a truth he wasn't ready to face. Her words about growing up in an orphanage echoed in his head like an unsolved riddle. Felipe couldn't ignore the signs any longer. He needed answers. The once quiet and monotonous rhythm of the mansion began to shift. It felt as though the past and present were weaving a fragile dance, with Felipe caught at the heart of it all. Driven by a newfound determination, he knew exactly who to call: Eduardo Maya. Eduardo was a private investigator who had stood by Felipe's side during the early, desperate years of searching for Amanda. Though every lead had ended in heartbreak, Eduardo had never wavered in his belief that there might still be a resolution. Felipe picked up the phone, his voice steady for the first time in years. "Eduardo, I need your help again. It's urgent. There's a young woman named Victoria working here at the mansion. I need to know everything about her. There's something I need to confirm." Eduardo, who understood the weight of Felipe's pain all too well, agreed without hesitation. "I'll be there as soon as I can," he said, his tone unwavering. Unaware of the storm her presence had unleashed, Victoria continued her work with quiet dedication. She was quickly winning over the staff with her warmth and hard work. For her, this job wasn't just employment. It was a fresh start, the chance to build a life of her own. But for Felipe, every gesture she made, every smile, and most of all, the delicate teardrop earrings she wore, were pieces of a puzzle he was desperate to solve. That morning, the mansion felt even more still than usual. Felipe sat in his study, flipping through an old photo album. Each page cut deeper than the last. There was Amanda, her golden hair catching the light, and her smile brighter than the sun itself. With Victoria now under his roof, those memories had taken on a new sharpness, as if the past and present were colliding in ways he couldn't explain. The sharp chime of the doorbell broke through the silence, announcing Eduardo's arrival. A chill ran down Felipe's spine as he stood to greet his old friend. Eduardo entered with the same firm posture and keen gaze that had once combed through endless clues in search of Amanda. He seemed ready to turn every detail into a revelation. "What did you find?" Felipe asked, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness despite his attempt to stay composed. Eduardo took a deep breath, his expression grave. The weight of his findings hung heavy in the air. What he was about to reveal could either deliver the closure Felipe had spent decades yearning for, or rip open wounds that had barely begun to heal. Felipe hesitated, as if giving voice to his thoughts might shatter the fragile hope budding inside him. Carefully, he handed Eduardo a photograph of Amanda, his hands trembling. His voice, thick with emotion, barely rose above a whisper. "Victoria is a new worker here," he began. "Eduardo, there's something about her. She wears an earring identical to the one Amanda was wearing the day she vanished, and she told me she was found as a baby, abandoned, with a hand-embroidered blanket. I need to know where she came from, who found her, everything." Eduardo's brows furrowed in intrigue. "An embroidered blanket? Did it have initials or any distinctive detail?" "She hasn't shown it to me yet," Felipe replied urgently. "But I need you to find out." Eduardo nodded, though his tone remained measured. "Felipe, we have to tread carefully. It might just be a coincidence. We can't let ourselves get carried away by something that might not hold up." Felipe gave a brief nod, but deep down, his rationality had already unraveled. The physical resemblance, the earring, the story of the blanket, it all felt like fate's voice breaking through 20 years of silence. As Eduardo began his investigation, Felipe found himself studying Victoria more closely. He watched her move around the kitchen, preparing meals with precision and chatting warmly with Rosa. Each small gesture, the way she tilted her head when lost in thought or bit her lip in concentration, brought him back to memories he had locked away. Flashbacks began haunting him. He vividly recalled the last morning he had spent with Amanda. The sun had poured over the garden, and she had run barefoot through the grass, her laughter filling the air as she clutched a tiny toy bird. He could almost hear his own voice from that distant day. "Take care of this earring, Amanda. It's special, just for you." Now, seated at his desk and watching Victoria from afar, Felipe couldn't suppress the thought that gnawed at his soul. Was fate finally reuniting a father with his daughter? The day Amanda disappeared had never left his mind. Felipe knew she had never left his wife's heart either. Those blissful moments with their daughter had turned into an unending nightmare. His wife, in her final years, had pursued every lead with relentless determination, visiting police stations, hospitals, and even consulting psychics in desperation. Time had been merciless to her, draining her strength piece by piece. Felipe had carried the burden of the search alone after her passing, an obsession that consumed him entirely. His story became a media sensation, plastered across newspapers. Friends he once trusted drifted away, accusing him of destroying himself for a ghost. Worse still were the betrayals, people who preyed on his grief, selling him false leads for profit. Each disappointment added another layer of ice around his heart. And yet, here he was, sitting in the shadow of 2 decades of loss, staring at a woman whose every movement stirred hope and fear in equal measure. No matter how cruel reality had been, Felipe had never let despair completely consume him. And now, with Victoria under his roof, the crushing weight of the past felt a little lighter. There was something new, a spark of hope, faint yet powerful enough to rekindle the strength he thought he had lost. After years lost in uncertainty, Felipe could feel the truth drawing closer, just within reach. A few days later, Eduardo returned to the mansion, his expression serious, his words deliberate, carrying the weight of a discovery. "Victoria was found at a church about a year ago," Eduardo began. "There are no records, no witnesses. All she had with her was a cotton blanket with a few embroidered initials." A chill ran through Felipe. Could it really be? The letters AP felt like more than coincidence. Eduardo continued, his voice steady. "I haven't seen the blanket yet, but the nun who took her in at the orphanage is still alive. I've already arranged a meeting with her." Felipe ran his hands over his face, caught between hope and fear. His eyes betrayed the storm of emotions within him. "Do it as soon as you can," he replied, his voice resolute. Before leaving, Eduardo gave him a hard look, his tone serious. "Are you ready for the possibility that it might not be what you're hoping for?" Felipe didn't answer. In his mind, there was no room for doubt. He had to believe. That evening, Victoria, worn out from the day's work, decided to retire early. Before turning off the light, she reached for an old blanket tucked away in her bag. The fabric, frayed with time, still carried a surprising softness. The light blue initials embroidered on the corner had always stirred a strange sadness within her. Since she was a child, she'd wondered about their meaning. Who were the people behind those letters? Her parents? Someone who had loved her but couldn't stay? As Victoria drifted into sleep with these questions circling her mind, Felipe, in another part of the mansion, clutched a photo of Amanda. The faint starlight illuminated his face as he whispered into the quiet night, "If it's you, Amanda, I swear I'll never lose you again." The small earring and the worn blanket now seemed bound by an invisible thread, pieces of a puzzle Felipe was determined to solve, no matter the cost. Fate appeared to be laying its cards on the table, and Felipe was ready to chase every clue, even if it was his last chance. The days at the Perez mansion unfolded under a heavy, almost suffocating silence. Felipe, always a man of few words, seemed more withdrawn than ever, lost in a storm of thoughts and what-ifs. From a distance, Victoria watched him with a mix of curiosity and caution. There was something about her employer's demeanor that tugged at her, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Meanwhile, both of them waited anxiously for news from Eduardo. The uncertainty lingered like a shadow over the house, but an invisible force seemed to pull them forward. Deep down, it felt as if they were closer to the truth than they had ever been. That morning, Victoria noticed a shift in Felipe's behavior. While she worked in the kitchen, carefully slicing ingredients for breakfast, she felt the weight of a gaze fixed on her. When she glanced up, Felipe was standing at the doorway. His expression was distant, as though he was staring through her, or perhaps at something only he could see. His eyes seemed to search for an answer somewhere between her and the silence around them. "Good morning, Mr. Perez. Would you like something special for breakfast?" she asked, her voice light and polite, hoping to ease the strange tension that hung in the air. It took him a few moments to reply. When he finally spoke, his tone was steady, but carried an edge of something Victoria couldn't quite name. "No, that's fine. Just carry on." Victoria frowned slightly, puzzled, but returned to her work. Still, the uneasy feeling of being watched lingered. It was as if an invisible thread tied her gaze to Felipe's, even as he remained rooted in the doorway, lost in his thoughts. Meanwhile, Eduardo pressed on with his investigation, piecing together fragments of Victoria's past that seemed long buried by time. After much effort, he managed to track down Sister Clara, the nun who had found Victoria on the steps of a church the night she was abandoned. At a modest convent, tucked away in a quiet corner of town, Eduardo met the elderly woman. Though the lines on her face betrayed her years, her sharp mind and warm demeanor shone through. When asked about that fateful night, her memory was vivid. "It was a bitterly cold evening," Sister Clara began, her voice soft but steady. "I heard crying outside, and when I opened the door, there she was, a tiny baby wrapped in a blue blanket with embroidered initials. She was healthy, thank God, but no one ever came looking for her." Eduardo handed the nun a photograph of Victoria as an adult. Sister Clara's lips curved into a gentle, nostalgic smile, and her eyes glistened with emotion. "Yes, that's her, the same eyes. How wonderful to know that someone is interested in her story. She was always special, even without knowing where she came from." Before leaving, Eduardo asked if he could take a photo of the blanket, still carefully preserved at the convent. Despite the wear of time, the embroidered initials remained visible. Once he took the picture, he immediately sent it to Felipe. When Felipe saw the photo, his heart raced. The initials, the embroidery style, everything matched exactly. It was as though a part of his past, one he thought was lost forever, had found its way back to him, bringing a mix of hope and confusion. He knew he needed to see it for himself. That night, as shadows stretched across the mansion, Felipe made a decision. Victoria needed to have that blanket back, and he would find a way, no matter the cost. Determined to uncover the truth, Felipe did something he never thought he'd do. As he entered Victoria's room, he was filled with a mix of guilt and urgency. He knew he was invading the privacy of someone who trusted him, but his need for answers outweighed any shame he might have felt. Inside the room, his eyes immediately fell on the old blanket. It was neatly folded on a chair, as if Victoria cherished it like something precious. When he touched it, the familiar fabric sent a wave of recognition through him. The embroidered initials confirmed what his heart had already known. It was as though fate had led them all to the revelation of a truth buried for so long. For the first time in years, Felipe felt as though he was on the edge of something extraordinary. Nearby, a forgotten suitcase sat in the corner, but something caught his eye. Another blue blanket with embroidered initials, A.P. His heart nearly stopped as he recognized what that could mean. It was as if everything he had searched for over the years had been right there, waiting for him. His hands shook as he picked up the fabric, an overwhelming wave of emotion flooding him. Felipe was certain that this blanket was connected to Amanda. Still holding the blanket, the sound of a door opening made his body freeze. Victoria had returned. She stopped in the doorway, surprised to see him there. Felipe, with the blanket in his hands, didn't know what to say, feeling exposed and speechless. "What are you doing here?" Victoria asked, her voice heavy with confusion and suspicion. Felipe turned slowly, unsure of where to begin, his eyes darting between Victoria and the blanket. I needed to see this blanket." "Where did you find it?" Victoria instinctively took a few steps forward and grabbed the blanket back, clutching it as though it were a precious treasure, something that protected her from forces she couldn't understand. Victoria held the blanket close to her chest, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It's all I've had. It's what they left with me when I was found. I grew up with it in the orphanage." Felipe exhaled sharply, trying to steady the rush of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He looked deeply into Victoria's eyes, his voice thick with a mixture of desperation and hope. "Victoria, I believe this blanket and that earring, they belong to my daughter. My Amanda was taken from me 20 years ago, and I never saw her again. And you," his voice faltered for a moment before he continued, "you might be her." Victoria froze, the weight of his words paralyzing her. Her eyes widened in disbelief, a flood of confusion and shock overtaking her. She took a step back, clutching the blanket to her chest as if it was the only thing that still made sense. That can't be true," she murmured, her voice wavering between denial and doubt. "I grew up in an orphanage. I don't know anything about my parents. How could I be your daughter?" Felipe felt the sting of her words, but refused to back down. He softened his tone, but there was an undeniable urgency in his voice. "I know it's hard to believe, but please, trust me. All I want is to find the truth. If you're willing, we can do this together." Victoria stood there, motionless, her mind racing to process the words she had just heard. 1,000 questions flooded her thoughts, yet, at the same time, something deep inside her, a gut feeling maybe, whispered that she couldn't ignore what was happening. The blanket, the earring, Felipe's story. They were pieces of a puzzle that were finally starting to fall into place. The air between them felt thick, charged with tension and anticipation. Felipe sensed that he was closer than ever to an answer, and for the first time, Victoria began to see her own past through a different lens. Despite the future still being shrouded in uncertainty, both felt that something pivotal was on the verge of being revealed, something that could change everything. The suggestion of a DNA test hung between them like a sentence that was just waiting to be spoken. Neither of them was truly ready for what might come next, especially Felipe, who couldn't bear to sit still, waiting for the results. His nights were restless, filled with fragmented memories and thoughts about what he would say to Amanda, or to Victoria, if his suspicions were confirmed. To him, the test was just a formality. The evidence was in the blanket, in the small details that screamed of hidden truths. Still, he knew he needed that official confirmation. Victoria, on the other hand, felt as though she were adrift. It was as if the very foundation of everything she had known was crumbling beneath her. The idea that her entire life could have been built on a lie was crushing. Every time she looked at Felipe, there was an inexplicable pull, a mixture of curiosity and mistrust, a connection she couldn't understand but couldn't ignore either. The day the results arrived felt like the climax of a long, painful wait. Eduardo, tasked with delivering the sealed envelope, found Felipe in his office. Victoria sat in the next room, pacing, her anxiety palpable, as if the very air was stretched tight, waiting for something to break. Felipe tore open the envelope with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the document for the single answer that mattered most. When he found it, he froze, breath caught in his chest for a moment. There it was. 99.9% match. Victoria was Amanda. For a long, silent moment, he stayed motionless, tears welling up in his eyes. After 20 years of searching, the confirmation he had dreamed of was finally in his hands. He stood slowly, still clutching the paper, and walked toward Victoria, who waited in the next room, heart racing in her chest. "Well?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her nerves fraying with anticipation. Felipe opened his mouth to speak, but was choked by emotion. Without a word, he held out the report for her to see. Victoria took the paper from him with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the words. Her face shifted through a whirlwind of emotions, disbelief, shock, and finally, a tentative acceptance. I'm your daughter," she whispered, as if the words themselves didn't quite make sense. Felipe nodded, tears now streaming freely down his face. "Yes, you're Amanda. My Amanda. I never stopped looking for you, not for a single day." Victoria staggered back a step, clutching the paper to her chest like a lifeline. The world she had known, the world that had once been so simple, was now upside down. "But how? I grew up in an orphanage. They never told me anything about this. How can I be someone who was kidnapped?" Felipe saw the confusion and pain in her eyes and took a careful step closer, not wanting to overwhelm her further. "I don't know all the answers yet," he said gently, "but I will find them. Someone took you from me, but now that I know you're here, that's all that matters. We'll uncover the truth, together." Victoria stood there, her mind spinning as she tried to make sense of the flood of information. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part hesitated, terrified of what it might mean for the life she had known. Torn between doubt and hope, she pressed her hands to her head, trying to sort through the overwhelming thoughts. "I need time," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper, fragile and broken. Felipe nodded quietly. He understood. He knew that the truth had hit her like a storm, shattering everything she thought she knew. Yet, deep down, he also knew there was more to uncover. The puzzle was still incomplete. One crucial piece remained missing. Who was responsible for the abduction? As Victoria grappled with her new reality, Felipe threw himself into the next stage of his search. Eduardo dug through old files again, revisiting every lead, every connection, anything that might shed light on the mystery. And then, one name surfaced. Ricardo Ortega, a former employee of a rival company to Felipe's. The discovery opened a floodgate of questions and fueled Felipe's resolve. He was closer to the truth than ever, but he still had to confront the ghosts that had haunted his past. Meanwhile, Victoria, with her heart torn, began to sense that for the first time she might actually be on the verge of discovering who she truly was. Ricardo had worked for the Almeida family, direct competitors of the Perez family in the real estate business. His history was filled with conflict, sabotage, and very public disputes with Felipe. Eduardo found that Ricardo had been fired shortly after Amanda's disappearance, which raised suspicions about his involvement in the crime that had destroyed Felipe's life. When Felipe learned this, an old fury resurfaced. Could Ricardo have been tied to the tragedy that had torn his family apart all those years ago? Felipe knew he needed to confront him, but he also understood the delicate nature of the situation. His priority was Victoria now, and he would do whatever it took to protect her, avoiding any unnecessary pain from the past. As the investigation moved forward, Felipe tried to get closer to Victoria, respecting her need for space, but offering support in subtle ways. One sunny afternoon, he invited her for a walk through the mansion's gardens. As they strolled through the flowers and ancient trees, Felipe shared memories of Amanda as a child. He spoke of how Elena, Amanda's mother, used to embroider blankets while singing. She always said she wanted Amanda to have something special from her, just in case one day she couldn't be there, Felipe said, his voice thick with emotion. These stories slowly began to break down the walls Victoria had built around herself. Little by little, she started to feel an unexpected bond forming between them. It was as if Felipe's words were filling in gaps she hadn't even realized existed. But even with this growing connection, the name Ricardo Ortega still loomed over them, like a dark shadow that refused to go away. Eduardo continued his pursuit of Ricardo, tracking him down to a small town where he seemed to be living a quiet, discreet life. Yet something about his routine suggested that he was hiding something. Felipe was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, no matter what it cost. While Felipe planned his next move, Victoria sat quietly in her room, holding a photo of Elena that Felipe had shown her. There was something about the image that connected with her in a way she couldn't quite explain. For the first time, Victoria felt like she might actually belong somewhere, as if, after all these years, there was a place for her in the world. But with that sense of belonging came a wave of anger, fury over the cruel game she had been caught in, over a life built on lies. She realized that meeting Felipe again was just the beginning. So many questions remained unanswered, and the truth behind her abduction had to be revealed. Felipe and Victoria were at the start of a journey that would force them to confront secrets buried for decades. And with it would come the truth about Ricardo Ortega and the role he had played in the suffering that had haunted their lives forever. Ricardo Ortega had spent over 20 years weighed down by a secret that never stopped tormenting him. His home, a modest and secluded place on the outskirts of a forgotten town, reflected the burden of guilt he could never fully bury. But the past, the one he'd tried so hard to outrun, came knocking relentlessly the day Felipe Perez and Eduardo Maya showed up at his doorstep. In that moment, Ricardo knew his life would never be the same again. Felipe entered Ricardo's home with the kind of determination only someone who had searched for 20 years could have. His presence was overwhelming, as if the weight of 2 decades of uncertainty was bearing down on him. His voice was deep, full of tension he could no longer contain as he spoke. "We know what you did 20 years ago. You took my daughter. It's time for you to tell the truth." Ricardo, visibly shaken, hesitated. His eyes flicked to Eduardo, who watched him with the same intensity, before turning back to Felipe. He let out a heavy sigh, as though accepting that there was no more running from the truth. "Come in," he said, his voice low and weary. "I think it's time you both learned everything." The inside of the house was simple, almost bare. In the living room, an old, worn sofa, a table scattered with faded photographs, and an atmosphere of melancholy that seemed to hang in the air. Ricardo sank into a chair, rubbing his face as though trying to wipe away a guilt that had never left him, and began to speak. "I never wanted to do this, but at the time, I had no choice. I worked for the Almeida family, and they would do anything to destroy you, Felipe." Felipe stood still, his body rigid, fists clenched, struggling to contain the fury that threatened to break free. Every muscle in his body seemed to pulse with anger. "They gave me an order," Ricardo continued, his voice shaking. "Taking your daughter was the cruelest way to hurt you. I tried to refuse, but they threatened me. Not just me, but my family too. They said if I didn't do it, horrible things would happen." Unable to hold back, Felipe stepped forward, his voice thick with indignation. "So you just took her? Out of fear? Didn't you think about what that would mean for me? For Amanda?" Ricardo lowered his head, his shame evident as the words tumbled out, almost as if he had been holding them in for too long. "I thought about it every day. When the time came, I couldn't do it. I couldn't hand her over to them. I knew what they'd do. I knew it would be horrible. So I did the only thing I could think of. I left her at the doorstep of a church. I knew she'd be safe there, that someone would take care of her. I know it was cowardly, but it was all I could do." Felipe's chest tightened as Ricardo's words hit him like daggers, reopening wounds he thought had healed. He ran a hand over his face, trying to process the revelation, as a storm of emotions churned in his mind. What Felipe didn't know was that Victoria, who had insisted on staying close to her father, was standing in the doorway, hearing everything. Her heart raced, her thoughts a whirlwind as Ricardo's words echoed in her mind. A fierce anger burned inside her. How could he justify abandoning her, claiming it was to protect her? He had left her alone, with no answers, no roots. Yet at the same time, a twinge of compassion crept in. The weight of guilt had clearly crushed Ricardo all these years. Victoria stepped into the room slowly, her gaze fixed on the man who had abandoned her and the father she had just found. She knew that nothing said in that room could change the past, but the answers she had been searching for were finally laid out before her, and with them came the certainty that her life would never be the same again. Victoria entered the room, her voice trembling as it shattered the silence that had settled between them. "Do you know what you did to me?" she said, her eyes filled with pain. "I grew up not knowing who I was, not understanding why I was abandoned. You stole that from me." Ricardo lifted his gaze and met hers. In that moment, it was as though he saw the full weight of her suffering. The sorrow on her face broke through any defenses he still tried to hold on to. I know, he murmured, "and there's not a single day that goes by that I don't regret it. I just wanted you to be safe." Victoria let out a bitter laugh, one that seemed to slice through the air. "You had no right," she shot back, her voice sharp. "No right to decide my fate. You left me behind because you were afraid." Felipe stepped toward her, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. His eyes remained locked on Ricardo, but there was something different in him now. The anger still simmered, tangled with the deep pain, but there was also something else, the need to move forward, to uncover the last pieces of the truth. "You should pay for this, Ricardo," Felipe said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "But deep down, I know you already have. The weight of that guilt, that's punishment enough." Felipe stared at him, his focus unwavering, but there was one question he had to ask, one answer he needed to hear. "Enough," he said firmly. "I just want to know one thing. Who was behind all of this? Who gave the order?" Ricardo hesitated, the truth on the verge of spilling out, and he knew he couldn't hide it any longer. "It was Mr. Almeida," he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "He was the one who wanted to destroy you, Felipe. The kidnapping was just part of the plan, but after that, After I got rid of Amanda, they left me alone. But then they threatened me again, told me never to say a word." He paused, his voice faltering as painful memories resurfaced. "The truth is, all these years, I've tried to rebuild my life, but I could never forget what I did. I couldn't." Felipe nodded slowly, the pieces finally clicking into place in his mind. He had suspected as much. Mr. Almeida, the man who had torn apart his life and stolen his daughter, was behind it all. And now that he was gone, his family still held power, still controlled the empire he had destroyed. A rising fury burned in Felipe's chest. They would pay for this, all of them. Meanwhile, Victoria remained silent, struggling to process everything she had just learned. The weight of the truth suffocated her, and she didn't know how to deal with it. Felipe, on the other hand, wrestled with a storm inside him. The thirst for vengeance still burned deep within his chest, but he knew one thing. He had to rebuild his relationship with his daughter. He had to find a way to move forward, no matter the pain. That night, as they walked through the garden, Victoria finally spoke, her voice breaking the silence between them. "Dad, I don't know how to feel about Ricardo. He took so much from us, but in some strange way he also saved my life. Everything is so confusing." Felipe sighed, his gaze lost in the stars above, as if searching for answers to the storm raging inside him. "I don't know either, Amanda," he said quietly, "but what matters now is that we're together. We'll take it one day at a time." Victoria looked at him, and for the first time the word father seemed to hold real meaning. The truth had been revealed, but its weight was heavy and complicated. Now, father and daughter had to face their biggest challenge yet: how to move forward after everything that had happened and build a future together, despite the scars left by the past. After a long process of rediscovery and reconnection, Victoria made a decision. She would change her name to Amanda Victoria, combining both parts of her identity. To her, that name represented the girl who had grown up not knowing who she was, and the lost daughter who had finally found her place in the Perez family. It was her way of honoring her past, embracing the uncertainty that marked it, and accepting the love and belonging of her present, with her father by her side. The soft light of dawn crept through the windows of the Perez mansion, bringing with it a fresh start for both Felipe and Victoria. After confronting Ricardo Ortega and uncovering Almeida's involvement, the dust was beginning to settle. Now, father and daughter were determined to look ahead, even knowing the marks of the past would never truly disappear. For the first time in many years, Felipe felt lighter. The weight of 20 years of relentless searching and pain was giving way to renewal, a hope that finally their family could heal and move forward. Felipe watched Victoria, busy in the kitchen with Rosa and the rest of the staff, laughing and talking. Something stirred in his chest, a warmth he thought he had lost forever. Elena, his late wife, lived on in Amanda, and though so much time had passed, Felipe felt like life was giving him a second chance. That afternoon, Felipe invited Victoria to talk in the garden, the same place where he and Elena had once dreamed together about the future of their family, before tragedy changed everything. Amanda, or rather Victoria, was still getting used to being called by both names. Felipe looked at her with tenderness, understanding that for all the years he had spent searching for answers, he had discovered something even more important than finding the daughter he had lost. He needed Victoria by his side, not to fix the past, but to build a future together. "I spent so many years searching for answers, but now I realize that what I really need is to have you here," Felipe said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not to fix what's already happened, but to build a future together." Victoria, still processing everything that had unfolded, smiled. The bond between them was growing stronger each day, but she still had her own internal battles to face. "I want that too, Dad," she said softly, her voice full of uncertainty. "But it's hard. I spent so much time not knowing who I was. Now I feel like I need to rediscover myself." Felipe nodded, understanding her words completely. He reached out and held Victoria's hand firmly. "We'll do it together, Victoria. I need to rediscover myself too. I need to learn how to be a father." In the following days, there were countless moments of connection and growth. Felipe shared old photos and videos from his childhood with Victoria. They laughed and cried together, realizing that despite the years apart, they had so many similarities, like their love for cooking, their insatiable curiosity, and most of all, a smile that seemed uniquely theirs. Victoria also began learning more about Elena, her biological mother. Felipe handed her a letter that Elena had written to Amanda just before she passed, filled with love and hope. Victoria read every word with tears in her eyes, feeling for the first time a true connection to the woman who had given her life. "It's incredible," Victoria whispered, holding the letter delicately. "I want to honor her memory, Dad. I want people to know what she meant to us." Together, they decided to hold a ceremony to honor Eleanor on her birthday. They planted a tree in the mansion's garden, symbolizing renewal and growth. The ceremony was simple, but deeply meaningful. Close friends and employees gathered, witnessing the strengthening of the bond between father and daughter. "This tree is to remind us that even in the midst of pain, we can grow and blossom again," Felipe said, his voice thick with emotion. "Elena always believed in the strength of family. Now I finally feel like we're honoring that legacy." Inspired by her mother's life and the renewed connection with Felipe, Victoria made a brave decision to share her story with the world. She wrote an article for a local blog, detailing how she had been found as a baby at a church, raised in an orphanage, and finally reunited with her father. The heartfelt and emotional piece quickly gained attention. Soon, Victoria was invited to speak at events, addressing themes like personal growth, identity, and forgiveness. With each word she shared, Victoria felt her story gaining the power to reach and inspire others. For the first time, she had found her place in the world. With Felipe by her side, she was ready to build a future filled with love, growth, and hope. Felipe watched his daughter with a mix of pride and admiration, seeing how she was transforming pain into something both powerful and inspiring. During one of the events, he approached her and, in a soft voice, said, "You're incredible, Victoria. Helena would be as proud of you as I am." Victoria smiled, finally feeling like she truly belonged to the Perez family. Over time, Felipe also found his own way to contribute to the cause that had touched him so deeply. He started funding projects aimed at helping abandoned children, supporting orphanages and adoption programs. In each of these projects, he saw a reflection of his own story, as if he were trying to turn a personal trauma into a positive legacy. Victoria, too, became actively involved in these efforts. Together, they began to build something much larger than themselves, a network of support for those facing loss, abandonment, or family struggles. On the last night of the year, Felipe and Victoria stood in the garden of the mansion, surrounded by the glow of Christmas lights. They shared a glass of wine as they watched the fireworks light up the horizon. "I never imagined we'd get this far," Felipe said, his voice calm. "But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can really live." Victoria smiled, a deep sense of peace in her expression, and replied, "I never imagined it either, but I think in the end, we found our place. Ours, Dad." As the fireworks painted the sky in colors, Felipe held his daughter's hand. It no longer mattered what they had lost along the way. What truly mattered was what they had found together. Not only had they rebuilt their relationship, but they had also discovered a new way to live, one marked by love, forgiveness, and the strength to move forward, no matter what the past had taken from them. In that moment, Felipe and Victoria realized that even the deepest wounds could give rise to something beautiful, an unbreakable bond, strong enough to weather any storm that might come their way. Did you enjoy today's story? If so, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and share it with your friends. We'll see you in the next video.